Good morning. This morning we're continuing our series on Christian living, Christian life. Our first week we looked at how prayer centers us, gives us lenses to see the world so that we can reclaim the sacredness of our everyday lives, reclaim the significance of our daily actions. And then we looked at work. We looked at how what we do as our occupations and how we act in the world can be sacred in and of itself as we work as really a mask of the providence of God. Sometimes when the Lord gives us our daily bread, He does it through you. This morning we're going to kind of continue that same line of thinking. In fact, last week's lesson and this week's lesson were originally one lesson. But when it hit about the 50-minute mark, I decided I should probably split this up. And so it's going to feel a little bit like a part two this morning because it kind of is a part two. But moving outside the dimension of work and our careers and our occupations, I want to look at how we can learn to see the eternal significance in our daily life and our daily choices as individuals, with our spouses, and in the family. And so what this boils down to is understanding what God has called us to do and what human potential really is. And where I want to start looking this morning, start to unpack that, is the very beginning. You see, when God speaks in Genesis 1, it gives us a little bit of the setting. The way it says it is, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. The way that the Hebrew talks about that earth, that without form and void, is tohu vavohu, tohu, chaos, and void. And so it's this really complicated thing to get into English, because what it basically means is chaotic, which we get that. We can understand chaos. We've had children who have messy rooms. We get that. But the thing that makes it hard to get into English is it's chaotic nothing. Chaotic nothingness. Now that's hard to picture. That's hard to understand. And what God does is He takes that chaotic nothingness, that less than nothing, and speaks. And He creates and He orders. If you watch how the story of creation falls out, He creates things like light and dark, air and sea. He creates things and then He orders them. He creates light and dark, and then He orders the sun for the day and the moon for night. He creates land and then He gives it order. He gives it vegetation. He gives people to work and order it. And that's really what the garden is about. The garden is us continuing God's ordering work. He gives the garden to Adam to tend, not just to enjoy. And so God pushes out this chaos, this unmade nothing, brings light and order and goodness. And He says, now you fill the earth, multiply, subdue it. He says, I've created, you're going to join me in this creation. But what do? When the serpent comes and deceives mankind, we reject order and embrace chaos. We reject the beauty of an ordered creation and instead choose our own unmaking. The way that Scripture talks about it is through one man, death has entered the world. And so when we, as Adam did, chose to go against God, what we're doing is embracing sin. And sin is not simply bad things we do. Sin is, in reality, I don't know how well you can see this picture up here, but it's someone's idea of what maybe that primordial chaos looked like before God speaks into the darkness. That's what we embrace. We embrace our death and our annihilation. And yet, God says we are more. There's this old concept in Christianity, it's reflected in Scripture, of the, in Latin, imago Dei, or English, the image of God. We are all made in God's image. And I don't think that means God looks like me. I really hope not. What I think that means is that at our core, we may be silly, dumb, corporeal, human, fleshy things, but at our core is eternity. At our core is that capacity that God Himself demonstrates to love and order and make beauty. And the way that manifests in us is kind of complicated. Because on one hand, we have who we are. And if you're anything like me, who we are is not that great. Right now. I bet you right now, if I asked you to name a dozen things you could do right now to make you better, you could probably come up with double that. There's this place that we have of who we are, and then we have who we are becoming. And the way that Scripture unpacks that is, he says, Romans chapter 8 unpacks it like this. He says, Paul says, we are being molded into the very image of the Son of God. And so we have this really uncomfortable place in the middle, that overlap where we embrace God's image right now. We're not fully reflecting it. And that's an uncomfortable truth to admit, but it also calls us into something greater. We embody that good creative work that God began, charged us to continue, and it still matters that we choose it today. Because our potential is limitless. Now you might be thinking, all right, Brian, that's a whole bunch of Bible and theology. Now, what does that have to do with how I live my life? Well, the answer is everything. Absolutely everything. Every day, in every situation, your actions either bring you one step closer to who you were or who you're going to be. They either take you closer to sin and death, or they take you closer to life and order. They either take you towards chaos and the annihilation of all that is, and the ultimate destruction that is destined for the devil and his angels, or they take you towards God and His blessing. And so how does that work? Well, in the morning, when you get up, you need to decide, am I going to be a blessing today? Am I going to embrace the calling that God has given me to be a force for good in the world? And we have almost untold potential to do that. Think of all the good things that you could do in a day. First thing that most of us do, most of us should do, is we get up, we put ourselves together, we make our beds. Maybe we make breakfast for our family. Think about the order that gives. You know, the number one cause of the way that psychologists talk about it is neurotic disorder, is not eating a good breakfast. It makes your mind stressed. It creates anxiety. They say it's a wonder how many disorders are treated just by changing your diet and getting ordered. Waking up at the same time and eating. Think about the difference that makes in the lives of your children. They can go to school, learn better, get better lives, better jobs, provide for their families better. And it started with you getting up and making some eggs. There is eternity in every action we take. And when you make those choices that are a blessing, it matters. And so I want to encourage you not to think of the mundane things that you do around your house, like cleaning, vacuuming, like the things that you do for yourself when you get yourself ready, when you're trying to put yourself together. Don't think of those things as trivial or as separate from spirituality, because indeed those are ordering your life so that you can be a blessing. And you're ordering others' lives as a blessing. You are pushing the chaos that threatens to destroy everything that is one step farther away every time you make a meal for your family. Every time you choose to look at the situation around you and say, is there a way I could make this situation better? And then do it. Don't just think it. Do it. You choose to embrace that infinite potential given to you by the image of God to be a blessing. And that matters today, and it will matter forever. The way that I think Scripture unpacks this best is actually in Proverbs 31. Now, this is technically, it talks about a wife, a woman who fears the Lord, an excellent wife. But I think this speaks not just to women, it speaks to everyone. This was what it looks like for someone to fear the Lord, to embrace their calling to be a blessing. It starts in verse 10. It says, an excellent wife who can find? She is far more precious than jewels. The heart of her husband trusts in her, and he will have no lack of grain. She does him good and not harm all the days of her life. She seeks wool and flax and works with willing hands. She is like the ships of the merchant who brings her food from afar. She rises while it is yet night and provides food for her household and portions for her maidens. She considers the field and buys it. With the fruit of her hand she plants a vineyard. She dresses herself with strength and makes her arms strong. She perceives that her merchandise is profitable. Her lamp does not go out at night. When you hear that, what is it? I mean, you think about, man, what a person who has their life together. They've got their priorities in order. They're accomplishing so much. And that's what we do. We look up to people like that. But what Scripture is telling us, and it's the truth, is that you can be somebody like that. If you would embrace the calling that God has given you. But unfortunately, we also have another potential. We read this morning in Deuteronomy chapter 30, starting in verse 15. God says to the people, He says, "Today I've set before you life and good and death and evil. If you'll obey the commandments of the Lord that I command you today by loving the Lord your God and walking in His ways and keeping His commandments and His statutes and His rules, then you shall live and multiply, and the Lord your God will bless you in the land that you are entering to take possession of it. But if your heart turns away and you will not hear, but are drawn away to worship other gods and serve them, I declare to you this day that you shall surely perish. You will not live long in the land you are going into the Jordan to possess. I call heaven and earth to witness against you today that I have set before you life and death, blessing and curse. Therefore, choose life, that you and your offspring may live, loving the Lord your God, obeying his voice, holding fast to him, for he is your life and length of days, that you may dwell in the land that your Lord swore to your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, to give them. See, the way that God talks about his choice that he set before us is he's giving you the option. He set before you curse and blessing, life and death. That's what we're talking about, that choice that starts in the center of who you are. Are you going to embrace the ordering of the world that God started at creation? Are you going to work against it? And we have untold potential to work against it. Think about the atrocities of the 20th century. Millions of deaths. Millions in war. Before the 20th century, people were pretty optimistic about humanity. They said, we're gonna conquer disease. We've got this brand new industrial revolution. We're going to have utopia in 50 years. But what they didn't count on is that same drive to make things better can be turned ugly. And you might think, well, nobody chooses to be a curse. Yes, they do. They do it all the time. We do it to our spouses. When we're in the middle of an argument and we know we could say something that could make this better and that could diffuse the situation, but we say, nah, I'm going to blow it up. We do that. We fight and we yell. We're a curse to our children. We think about the things that we could do to help them, make them better, but we choose other things instead. We're a curse. We choose to be a curse often. And it's because of that same thing that we talked about in Genesis. It's that fall where we chose the curse. Human potential has two sides. And we have infinite potential in either direction. The problem is, the choice is ours. We, in fact, individually, each one of you stands as the border between chaos and peace. The heart of man is the last bastion, the last barrier between the world of blessing and the destruction of what is. And what we need to do is be aware of that. If you're aware of this, if you understand that every action you take matters, your actions take us one step closer towards either blessing or destruction. That changes how we live. Now the problem is, it's a lot easier not to believe that. But the trade-off is a meaningless life. You say, well, my actions don't matter. I'm just one person. In the big scheme of things, when I'm gone, 200 years from now, it's not going to matter. And so many people have taken that route. And you would think, why would you choose a life of meaninglessness? Why would you choose that? Well, I don't think it's not obvious at all. The trade-off for choosing meaning in your life is choosing responsibility. And we don't want that. To understand that every decision in your life matters is a horrible realization to make, because it takes you, it moves you to act for the good, and so often we don't. And so often people choose to live lives devoid of meaning so that they can avoid this very responsibility. But we as Christians do not have that option, because God has called us to be the border between peace and chaos. And so this morning, I want you to think about your life. Think about all the ways that your life is disordered right now. Take a couple seconds. I know you'll get some. And now, think about what you can do today, right now, to reorder it. Sometimes it's going to take years of consistent work to reorder your life, because some of us are really messed up. But that doesn't excuse us from our responsibility. God has set before us life and death. He calls heaven and earth to witness against us. The choice is yours, he says. It's there. I've put it in front of you. Choose life. This morning, maybe you made that choice a long time ago. You decided, I'm going to choose life by giving mine up, being buried with Christ in baptism, and accepting my calling. Maybe you've never done that, and this is the time for that. But most of the people in this room have. So I suspect maybe you're like me, and you need to recommit to the purpose to which God has called you. To understand that whatever your life has done, whatever routes your life has taken, and and you've become unordered and chaotic, that is a reason, not an excuse. Our obligation to fulfill our calling as these borders of chaos and peace is non-negotiable. If you need to recommit and you need the prayers of the church, this is the time for that. If you have any need, would you come as we stand and as we sing?